Hey there, it's Sophie, and I have a question for you. Do you know what microbes have to do with sleep? And have you even thought about the possibility of them treating conditions such as insomnia? Well, let's first talk about sleep. That wonderful activity that we get to do all night and sometimes even during the day. Well, it turns out that not all people are as privileged to, enjoy this activity. And there has been this trend over the past few years maybe in which YouTubers say like, hey, I tried this out for 1 week, like sleeping 4.5 hours, and it made me feel wonderful. Well, if there's one thing that I want you to get out of this video is that we all need to sleep. I'm not here to tell you how many hours because we have already seen that there's a little bit of a question there, but I'm here to tell you that we do need to sleep. Now, the question is how? How do we sleep? And the first concept that we need to know is circadian rhythm. You may have already heard of it also because it's all over health and fitness blogs and blogs about psychology and the brain and whatever. But to my understanding and throughout the research I've been doing, the circadian rhythm is actually a kind of abstract concept. It is the way in which your body arranges, does this agreement with the rest of your body. It synchronizes everything to produce certain substances. And it has to do with light, and it has to do with melatonin and a bunch of other things. But let's first, define the different sleep stages which have to do with the sleep cycle. And the first one is called non-rapid eye movement 1. There are actually 3 non-rapid eye movement phases and 1 rapid eye movement phases. So the non-rapid eye movement is about light sleep. Your muscles relax and your heart rate and breathing and eye movements begin to slow down. In the non-rapid eye movement 2 phase, you have a deeper sleep. Your body relaxes more and you continue slowing down every process inside your body. Also, your temperature drops, and it is the longest stage, apparently. Now, the non-rapid eye movement 3 is the most important one because as your heartbeat, breathing, and brainwave activity are at the lowest levels, the most important thing is that your body is repairing itself. Finally, the rapid eye movement phase is it begins about 90 minutes after you fall asleep, and it is just what it sounds like. Your eyes will move back and forth rather quickly under your eyelids, and your breathing and heart rate will begin to increase. So this is when you dream. That's why the moon is there. Now, I was mentioning before that not all people get to sleep actually. There are 50 million people in the US alone that suffer from sleep disorders, and guess what? 30% of them are actually suffering from something called insomnia, which is the inability, the disability to be able to fall asleep or continue being asleep once you, go to your bed. Another sad thing about this is that actually 90% of, not more than 90%, actually 95% of people who suffer from insomnia have to take medications. So this is something that I personally don't consider that desirable, but we also have to take into account that we are living in the 21st century and that it is just a privilege to be able to have these medications in order to treat sleeping disorders. And talking about these medications, there are actually a few types of them. One is called benzodiazepines. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly because it's such a confusing name, but what you should know about these is that they've been approved by the FDA to treat insomnia, and they're good for the short and the medium term, but for the long term they haven't been recommended, haven't been proven to be used for that, to be good for that. And they are said to have a high potential for abuse and dependence, which takes me to the non-benzodiazepines, which are basically counteracting this dependence potential of the previous ones, and abuse potential as well. Other types are melatonin and agonists, and these pretty much emulate the the processes that melatonin does and the effects that melatonin has in your body. If you didn't know this already, melatonin is considered to be the hormone of sleep because it makes you it basically makes you sleep. Basically makes you tired. So what's the problem with this? I've already mentioned that it's a privilege to have these medicines to be able to treat disorders, sleeping disorders, but at the same time, there are 3 problems that I personally identified with this. The first one is, of course, dependency. People are actually scared of becoming dependent to these kind of medicines, which is also the reason why a lot of people are looking for some alternatives, which are sometimes sleeping therapies, which sometimes have been proving to be effective, but, it is still kind of an alternative only. The second one is that, as I was mentioning before, they aren't good for the long term, including melatonin hasn't been proved to be good for the long term. And which takes me to the third root cause, to the third cause of the problem, or the third problem, which is that they aren't attacking the root cause of the problem itself. To my understanding, they're just like making you sleep today, making you sleep tomorrow, and maybe the day after tomorrow as well, but they're not helping you attack that root cause of the problem why you don't sleep. So I think this can be improved a lot, and this takes me to asking a lot of questions. One of them is, how is melatonin produced? Melatonin is born in the pituitary gland, which is a very tiny gland in your brain, which produces darkness prompts it to produce melatonin, while light causes it to stop this production of the melatonin. So going deeper into how this happens, we should know that the previously mentioned master clock is a region of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, the SCN for short. And here's a little bit about how the SCN is involved in sleep. So first, it receives an input from the photosensitive ganglion cells in the retina via the retinal hypothalamic tract. What this basically means is that it receives light input from the retina cells in your eyes. The second step is activating the genes that are related to the circadian clock. They are called clock genes, actually. And the third step is sending that information to the pineal gland to modulate the body temperature, production of hormones such as, you guessed it, cortisol and, melatonin, of course. So summing up to this point, and before mentioning what this information is, the SCN is a region in the hypothalamus that is colloquially known as the master clock. It sends information to the pineal gland, which will use the available tryptophan to produce serotonin and then melatonin. We are going to talk about these substances later on, but so that information that the SCN sent to the pituitary gland is called GABA, and GABA stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid, again another complicated name, but what we should know about GABA is that it is present when there is light, and another thing about GABA is that without it we can't have melatonin, therefore that's where the statement comes, like the initial statement that melatonin is it is produced when there is no light, because if there is no light, there is no GABA. So, that's kind of it. But talking about the substances that were previously mentioned, melatonin comes from something called tryptophan, and tryptophan is an essential amino acid that can be found in food such as turkey or milk. Tryptophan, thanks to a series of chemical reactions, is turned into serotonin, and serotonin is the hormone of happiness, but as you are seeing now, it is also involved in the production of melatonin, and therefore it is involved in sleep. Melatonin is indeed the hormone of sleep, and yes, it comes from serotonin. So there are actually a lot of intermediate steps into this, but overall these are the main steps. Now, the shocking fact is that serotonin is produced 90% in the gut. So we were mentioning at the beginning, the initial question, the very first question that I asked you is that if you thought that bacteria or microbes had to do something with sleep. So why? Why is the reason why serotonin is produced 90% in the gut could actually have to do with bacteria. So, and enterochromaffin cells. So enterochromaffin cells are basically the cells that release serotonin in response to luminal distension, parasympathetic innervation, or changes in osmotic concentrations in the lumen. In other words, it reacts to its environment and produces serotonin. And this helps regulate gastrointestinal functions and movement. But the question here is if it actually has to do something with the production of melatonin ultimately. And what do bacteria have to do with this? Well, let me introduce you to the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome is a community of bacteria, fungi, archaea, and other microorganisms that live inside of your gut. And we are starting with the shocking facts, and the first shocking and mind-blowing fact is that there is 1 kilogram of microbes in your body, in your gut, specifically in your colon, that are actually communicating with your brain, which is the second shocking fact. This is a little bit recent, like the discovery that the gut microbiome and microbiota communicate with your brain, but it has actually been proven a lot. There are a lot of studies that back up this statement, so we are completely sure that this is happening, and this is happening actually thanks to the vagus nerve, which is the largest brain and the largest nerve in the human body. So the vagus nerve has vagal fibers, which are spread all around the digestive wall, and these vagal fibers communicate with the microbes in your gut. So the microbes in your gut produce certain substances which are diffused and can sometimes be passed into other cells, such as the Enterochromaffin cells, which we were talking about earlier on. And yeah, so that's basically it. So in other words, not to make this confusing, the microbes communicate with your brain thanks to the microbiome gut-brain axis, which involves the vagus nerve. Now, another shocking fact is that recently researchers discovered that the more diverse the gut microbiota in a person is, the better sleep they're going to have. So by diversity, we mean more different types of microbes. And by better sleep, we mean basically in terms of efficiency and time. However, what this study didn't mention is how does this actually happen. It actually left that as a question to be answered. What are the mechanisms that drive this correlation? Because actually what I think is that they just discovered not a correlation but actually a coincidence. They didn't know how this was happening. They mentioned something called interleukin 6, which is kind of a cytokine related to sleep, but further than that they didn't know about the underlying mechanisms. However, other studies have already proven that bacteria can metabolize tryptophan, and they can actually affect the available tryptophan in your body. And if you remember well, tryptophan is that first step into producing melatonin, which is the hormone of sleep. So, yes, that's another shocking fact. And the other one is that they can produce serotonin, like from scratch. Not from scratch, actually from the available tryptophan, thanks to a hormone called tryptophanase, I think. So yeah, that's one shocking fact, and the other one is that the circadian clock genes are actually influenced by the clock of the microbiome itself. But still, we don't know the answer to the underlying mechanisms of all of these facts. Like, we know that yes, bacteria can produce the substrate that produce melatonin. We know that they communicate with the master clock and with the master clock genes and all of that. But we don't know the metabolic pathways that are behind this. But let's just talk a little bit about the probiotics, which are, in my opinion, a potential solution to insomnia. So probiotics are basically just these substances that contain living things. And by living things, we mean things such as bacteria. And so probiotics can be taken orally and can just go into your microbiome and do whatever they're supposed to do, because yes, they have a specific function, but they aren't genetically modified or anything like that. They're just doing their own thing the way they know to do it. So what are the steps into producing probiotics? The first one is selection and isolation. Selection of the strand of bacteria that we're working with, the type of bacteria, and isolating them. Then we have to culture them. We need to formulate the medium, the kind of the substances that are going to help us grow the bacteria. The second one is fermenting the bacteria. Then we have to centrifugate it in order to separate it from the metabolites that may be, in that mix. And then we need to do some cryoprotection, adding some substances to basically help the probiotics have a longer shelf life. And after that, we freeze dry them, which has the same purpose as having a longer shelf life. Freeze drying is such an interesting process because it basically extracts all the water or liquids that are inside of whatever thing or substance, including fruits. Sometimes this is a very used process in order to make things just last longer for potentially decades. In any ways, you can then dosage them, which basically means to let them have like this shape in which you want people to take the probiotics. It can be in a pill, it can be in powder, or any other form that you wish. You have to package them and, of course, have some quality control because even though this is not precisely medicine, you're treating with something that can be ingested by people, so you need to be very careful with that. And since we are talking about the production, we should also keep into account that this has to do with the industry, right? We are no longer doing research about it. We are no longer producing like tiny substances or tiny fragments of these probiotics, but we are actually willing to produce them at an industrial scale. So different engineering of the industry have to be taken into account, and how you're going to basically, as the word says, scale the process. And another thing is commercialization. How are you actually gonna do the marketing of this? And actually, even scientists suggest that you do the market research while you're doing the clinical trials, because otherwise you could be producing something that isn't really commercializable. And now, another potential solution to these problems, to insomnia, are living medicines. So living medicines have to do with synthetic biology, which is the discipline that combines engineering principles with everything we know about biology in order to standardize life. In specifically, living medicines are those genetically modified organisms, like commonly bacteria, that can be introduced into the human body. So basically, you just introduce a genetic circuit into a bacteria, let's say, and then you can introduce that orally into a person, or you can inject that into the bloodstream, or inject that into a tumor, specifically if you want to, let's say, treat cancer. So yes, these can be used not only to treat cancer, but other conditions that they have a very specific purpose, which is to help people have a better health. And the reason why there are like such a breakthrough, in my opinion, is because otherwise, in the context of the gut microbiome, people will have to take a fecal transplant, which is basically not that pleasant for a lot of people, I believe. So living medicines are an alternative to shape the gut microbiome of a person. However, throughout my research, I'm going to give a little bit of a personal note here, and this is that I started doing research about synthetic biology in October with, the aim of doing something with synthetic biology, and I learned a lot about genetic circuits, and I learned a lot about the gut microbiome, but getting deeper, into the mechanisms of the gut microbiome and how it influences sleep, I came to the conclusion that I probably wouldn't be using synthetic biology to solve this problem. If I were to solve this problem, of course, or give another solution to it, because there are already all these medicines. But in short, I realized that probably synthetic biology would be a much more complex solution to a problem that could have a simpler solution. And I believe personally that in order to solve a problem, you just need to find the simplest solution and the most efficient one. And I think that actually probiotics can be the answer to this. And the good thing about them is that there was actually a survey done in the US by the National Institutes of Health that actually was, answered by a lot of people, and they found out that actually 4 million people in the US alone take probiotics in sort of a constant rate and almost pretty much a daily basis, or maybe not in a daily basis, but they not only know about what probiotics are, but they're actually using them, which, if you remember, is part of the process of commercializing one of these technologies, if you may call it like that. So, of course, there is a lot of research to do still, and it has to do with the how. So, even when we know all these correlations and we know all these shocking facts, we are missing to know the metabolic pathways behind this. So, I think that one very interesting question to ask would be, does the serotonin produced in the gut microbiome have to do something with the production of melatonin? And that's something we don't know, because we don't know if that serotonin is being used only by the gastrointestinal tract to undergo digestion, or if it's being sent through the vagus nerve to the pineal gland, so the pineal gland can produce melatonin. But overall, and having done these research, I have been amazed by how microorganisms, tiny living things, can influence things such as our health and not only sleep, but also obesity and our food cravings and depression. And there are also correlations between the gut microbiome and conditions such as autism or schizophrenia even. So it is absolutely mind blowing. And yeah, so in the end, I just hope that you've learned something new, that you've reconsidered how important sleep is for our bodies and how it is privileged to have these medicines, but we can also make something better. We can make things work in a better way. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up, and also check out the article that I wrote about this. It is everything is explained in much more detail in that article, but without further things to say, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.